And good afternoon, Pittsburgh Steelers fans, and welcome to another edition of Steelers Brunch with Tony. I am your host, Tony Defeo, and thank you as always for joining me on this very fine and lovely and, as always, hot Saturday afternoon. And before I get started, I just wanted to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have at least one podcast a day, such as this one. Sometimes there's two a day, sometimes three. We have The Standard is the Standard, hosted by Dave Schofield, the behind the steel curtain editor. Michael Beck's in there, the deputy editor, and Brian Anthony Davis is on there sometimes. Lance Williams. And of course, there's Yeah, I Said It, hosted by Lance Williams every Friday. There is the Steelers Preview, hosted by Dave, Brian, Michael, Lance. There is the Stat Geek, hosted by Dave and his big brother, Big Bro Sco. There's Steelers Q&A, hosted by yours truly and Brian Anthony Davis every Monday at 5. That's in the off season. And as of late, following Steelers Q&A, there's the Steelers Retro Show, where we talk about Steelers things from the past, and I'm really enjoying that show so far. It's really one of my, as I keep saying, one of my favorite things. And of course, in the regular season, the Steelers Q&A is called Steelers Hangover, where Brian and I discuss the previous day's Steelers game. And thank you all for joining me in the live chat. There's Kathy Forrid, Sean Manahan, Reed Overand, Justin Conway, Ryan O'Toole, Jared Devil, some familiar faces, and I thank you all for joining me, and whoever else decides to join throughout the next 30 to 45 minutes or so. I look forward to talking to you and sharing with you some Steelers news. And speaking of the latest Steelers game, it looks like it's going to be, when is the first game? The 13th, the 14th of September. So it looks like there will be a full regular season and a full training camp, because on Friday it was reported that the NFLPA and the NFL owners had come to an agreement. They had reached an agreement on a deal that will allow them to have a safe and full training camp and a full regular season. Well, as safe as you can be amid a pandemic, but that's what the whole point was. As recently as last weekend, many NFL players, including J.J. Watt and even Terrell Edmonds, were pretty vocal on social media about the uncertainty surrounding the start of training camp, because there were so many things that had yet to be ironed out, such as testing. Would players be allowed to opt out? What happens if a player is tested positive, et cetera, and there was concern that training camp, training camp wouldn't start on time, and it would obviously compromise the start of the regular season. Would there be 12 games, 14 games, 16 games? Well, now it looks like there will be a full season. I mean, it's not official yet. I think it was approved. It was voted on by the player reps, the team reps, but it still has to be ratified with a vote by the union, the rank and file of the players. So it's expected to pass. So if it does pass, then that's good news. If you were wondering if the beginning of the 2020 NFL season would be compromised, would be shortened, would be delayed, postponed, or even canceled, you just never know. And at a time like this, which is totally unprecedented, but I'm actually excited about it, and it's going to be an interesting training camp, because how it's going to go is, obviously there are no preseason games. That was made official with this new agreement. There are going to be no preseason games. And when the players do report, which all veterans are expected to report by the 28th, when players do report, they're going to have I think a 21-day ramp-up period where they get tested and multiple times, and of course there's going to be a strength and conditioning period before they even begin practicing in pads, which all this information is all over the place, and it's hard to really, this is unprecedented for me too, because I'm used to a regular off season. So when I tried to read all this information as much as possible yesterday and today to get prepared for the show, and I still don't quite understand everything, but it looks like the players will begin begin practicing in pads by the middle of August, third week in August, somewhere in there, and they will do so up until the start of the regular season, and that's going to be a twist, a wrinkle that we've never seen before for an NFL training camp, before the start of an NFL season. And some of the changes, training camp rosters will go from 90 to 80. So obviously that's gonna affect so many players that could have put on the bubble to make it, could have made a name for themselves and stuck onto a roster. So that's going to affect that. But the good news for them is the practice squad, for at least for 2020, has been expanded to 16 players instead of, I think it was 10. I'm not exactly sure how many were before. Maybe somebody can answer that in the live chat. But it's going to be harder for like we've been talking about all summer. It's going to be harder for fringe players, or like undrafted free agents, maybe late round draft picks, maybe guys that were on the bubble, that would have been on the bubble anyway, such as a guy like Derwin Gray. It's going to be harder for those guys to make the team because there's just not going to be enough of a chance for them to shine and show what they can do. But the good news is, Mike Tomlin has said, and I've repeated this several times, Mike Tomlin has said in the past that what those guys do at a training camp on the practice fields at Latrobe this year, Heinz Field, will impacts their chances of making the team just as much as what they do in the preseason. So, you can look at it several different ways. You can look at it that way, and you can also look at it as far as how ready will the team be? How ready will these veterans be for the regular season? Well, how much the veterans play in the preseason anyway? Ben certainly hardly ever plays. He plays usually 2 or 3 series in a preseason. And as far as the other star players like a Juju or a James Conner, the offensive linemen, the veterans along the line, even defensive players, they don't play as much as they would if they were younger. They don't, usually preseason games are reserved for the backups and the guys that are trying to make a roster. So I don't know how much it's going to affect them not having a preseason, but it's certainly going to be different. With this 2 or 3 week ramp up period where you're at Heinz Field every day and not actually practicing, and you're just testing for the coronavirus and you're doing strength and conditioning drills, that kind of thing. Or I should say strength and conditioning training, not drills, training. That's going to be different. And then, you're just going to practice all the way up until the start of the regular season. So it's going to be different. And as I've said before, the teams that thrive in this environment this year are probably going to be the ones that don't, as Mike Tomlin likes to say, that don't blink in the face of adversity. And Mike Tomlin has a pretty good history of always doing a really good job at times when maybe his team could very easily mail it in. We've seen that in the past, as recently as last year when they lost Big Ben in the second game, and they still managed to stay in the playoff hunt all the way until the final moments of the last regular season game. So I think this might be the year where the best teams don't necessarily win or contend for the playoffs, but the teams that are able to keep forging ahead in the face of adversity. So that's what it means for that's what we're talking about when it comes to this new agreement. But I guess the good news, if you're a Steeler fan, even though they've missed the playoffs the last 2 years, is it doesn't look like there's very many starting positions up for grabs, which is, I guess that's good when you're dealing with a training camp such as this one. That's totally unprecedented. I mean, there's the right tackle spot between Zach Banner and Shuk Okorafor. That's up for grabs. But even if neither guy seizes the moment, you have the insurance policy of Matt Filer, who has been your starting right tackle the last 2 years. He could very easily slide right back over to right tackle. And then you have Stefan Wisniewski, the veteran free agent signing. I mean, they want him to be the versatile backup, the guy that can play center and guard. But if he has to, he could probably jump in and start, at least until maybe Kevin Dotson, your 4th-round pick out of Louisiana, maybe he makes a big leap this year and is on the details by the end of the year and maybe can win that starting job or get thrust into the starting role by the end of the year. I mean, it's a long shot, but my point is there aren't very many starting jobs up for grabs. I don't think there are any other than that one I just mentioned. I mean, you're pretty solid along the rest of the offensive line, provided Banner and Okorafor, provided one of them wins the right tackle spot. And of course, James Conner is your starting running back. Juju is your number 1 receiver. And as far as who's number 2 and 3, I think that's pretty interchangeable between Deontay Johnson and James Washington. And of course, you have Chase Claypool, who he's a rookie, so he looks impressive on tape, but he's unproven, so it's hard to really factor him in at this point, especially with everything I've discussed with training camp and how that's going to be different. And the fact there have been no OTAs, no rookie camp, no mini camp up to this point. Of course, the defense is fairly well set. I guess there's the matter of finding a new starting nose tackle to replace Javon Hargrave. But again, as we've talked about many times, how often are they in their base defense where they're going to need the nose tackle in there? Like, I'm not an expert on that kind of thing, but I do know that they only play their 3-4 base defense like a third of the time over the last couple of years. That's what the numbers have been. So I don't know how important that is. I mean, we know who's starting in the secondary. We know who's starting at linebacker. And again, other than nose tackle, there really isn't anything to determine there on the defensive line. Switching back over to offense, I think Vance McDonald is established as your number 1 tight end, and Eric Ebron is your number 2, and a major upgrade over Jesse James from a couple years ago, and certainly last year. So that's one good thing they have going for them. Even though they've missed the playoffs the last 2 years, and sometimes teams in that position have a lot of starting spots up for grabs. But in a year when you want to kind of know what your roster looks like, amid a pandemic, I think they're in pretty good shape. Doesn't mean they're going to contend. Doesn't mean they're going to be very, very good. But I tend to think they are going to be pretty good, because I think this has a chance to be one of the more complete teams that they've had in a while, provided Big Ben is the old Big Ben. I've talked about that before. And, they might not have the offense that they had in the mid 2010s with Brown and Bell and Ben, the killer bees in that offensive line. But I think overall, this is they have a chance to have their most complete team since, I think, 2010, when the last time they went to the Super Bowl. So that's my first topic. It's going to be, actually, no, I'm not done with that yet. I'm not done. Yeah, I rehearsed this all in my head, and I forgot one important thing. How's this going to affect 2021 and beyond? One of the interesting things that came out of the latest agreement was a financial situation, and that's to do with the salary cap. It's not going to affect this year. It's expected to be $198 million. That's the salary cap for 2020. But since there's going to be a lot of revenue loss this year because there won't be fans in the stands for games, or there shouldn't be anyway. There likely won't be. There shouldn't be. There likely won't be fans in the stands this season in 2020. It's going to be a major revenue loss for the NFL. We've discussed that before. We've written about that before. It's going to be billions of dollars. So how do you make up for that? Well, you make up for that by lowering the salary cap, and it looks like it's going to be spread over the next few years, starting next year in 2021, when the cap's going to go. It's expected to go from 198 to 175, and the Steelers, who are always up against the cap to begin with, including this year, I mean, they're going to be one of, I think I read 8 teams that are, if it were 175 right now, they'd be way over the cap. So that's going to have some huge ramifications for them starting next off season. I mean, what do you do about? Obviously, you're going to have to keep TJ Watt. There's no way you let that guy walk. But what about Cam? What about Minka? Do you just say, well, forget it? There's no way we could even try to sign a guy like Juju, who's going to command, provided he has the year that provided he rebounds in 2020 and has the year that he had in 2018, he's going to command number 1 receiver money on the open market. You can forget about even trying to sign Bud Dupree. So, and they could have to cut several guys, to be in compliance with the cap. So, yeah, it's great that there's football this year, and I'm looking forward to it. I think we all need a sports break, especially those of us who only have basic cable and can't see baseball and basketball and hockey on a regular basis, like yours truly. I'm really looking forward to watching some football. But starting next year, it could be, they might have to make some tough decisions a lot sooner than they thought they would. I think before all this started back in March with the pandemic, with the coronavirus pandemic, the projected salary cap was for 2021 was supposed to be like 210 million, 215 million. So you shave what, $35-40 million off of that projected total, and you shave $23 million off of it from 2020. Yikes! What are they going to do? Obviously, if Ben is still Ben, they're not going to get rid of him, and he's a huge part of their salary cap. So I don't know, but it's again, it's great that they're moving forward with a regular season, but we could be seeing as fans of the NFL, we could be seeing the ramifications of the revenue loss from 2020 for many years to come. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out in the future, but that's for the future. That's just, right now it's great that we'll have a 2020 regular season to look forward to. As of right now, these things are always day to day. When you're dealing in unprecedented times, you just never know what tomorrow may bring. But I think this is a really great sign that the players and the owners have come together and reached an agreement to move forward with the 2020 regular season. So that's all I want to say about that. And like last week, I want to get into some controversial topics, but they're all about football. And that's one person, Antonio Brown, who temporarily announced his retirement on Monday because he was frustrated. Let's be real. He was frustrated with the lack of progress in terms of the NFL's investigation into his off-the-field activities, which are pretty bad. The sexual assault allegations, which he's currently facing a lawsuit for, and the incident in Miami a couple of years ago when he was throwing furniture off the balcony, just really bad stuff. And just how he behaved in Oakland when he was traded to the Raiders for a 3rd and 5th pick prior to last season. He got himself cut before the end of training camp. He's just really in a bad way right now as far as his personal life, or at least he was up until a few months ago. He's been pretty quiet recently, up until he announcing his retirement on Monday, and then changing his mind and saying he wants the NFL to hurry up with his with their investigation and kind of get it over with so he can move forward. But when he, that brief period when he did announce that he was going to retire on Twitter, it suddenly started a debate between fans and the media about whether or not Brown was a Hall of Famer and whether or not he was a better receiver than Hines Ward and whether or not he was the best receiver in Steelers history. In my opinion, he was. I've said that many times. I said that even after when I was pretty darn angry at the end of the 2018 season, when everything that transpired the way it did with him walking out of practice prior to week 17 and Mike Tomlin deactivating him for that final game, and him, I guess he left at halftime, and then of course he got himself traded. He burned every bridge on the way out of town. He, disrespected Ben, disrespected Mike Tomlin, just really badmouthed them in the media and on social media. So I was pretty angry at the time, but I was still willing to acknowledge that he was probably, in my opinion, the best receiver that they have ever had. So the question is, is he going to go to the Hall of Fame? If he never plays another down, will he make it to the Hall of Fame? And I think he will. I mean, numbers be damned. Some players you don't need numbers. They transcend numbers. You just look at them and look at how they played and how they performed throughout their career, and that guy is a Hall of Famer, right? Like Troy Polamalu is a great example as far as I'm concerned. Did we know Troy's stats? I mean, granted, he's a safety, and you don't know the stats of safeties like you do pass rushers and, of course, skill position players. But if you watch Troy play with the sound down, not knowing that the Steelers won 2 Super Bowls when he played and made it to a third, you would say that's a Hall of Fame football player, right? Like Dick Butkus. He never played on a playoff team with the Bears, but he was far and away he was the best inside linebacker who ever lived up to that point in the history of the NFL. And there was no question he was the first ballot Hall of Famer. So I think that's how you have to judge certain players. Not about whether they won Super Bowls or their numbers. It's about when you watch them play, were they the premier player at their position over an extended period of time? And Troy was certainly that. And if you'll excuse me, I need my weekly 20-minute drink break. That's good stuff. Anyway, and by the way, that was still just Diet Pepsi, so don't worry. But where was I? Antonio Brown, Hall of Fame. Does he deserve it? Yes, he deserves it. If you want to look at a player like Troy, for example, he was truly dominant between 2004 and 2010. After that, he kind of sort of started going downhill a little bit. In the last few years that he was here, he was certainly the last year he was here, he was a shell of his former self, right? He just wasn't the player he was when he was a first-team All-Pro and he won Defensive Player of the Year in 2010. He had a 6-year period where he dominated, and he was you knew he was an all-time great strong safety. There was no question about it. And that's why he's in the Hall of Fame, because of that stretch between 2004 and 2010. That's why Troy Polamalu was voted a first-team Hall of Fame football player, because of that stretch. Mean Joe Green, believe it or not, is another example. Between 69 and 75, that time frame, I mean, he was just an absolute dominant force, totally unblockable. You ask Andy Russell, they had to hold him. I mean, the offensive lineman had to hold him in those days, because he was just essentially you couldn't block him one-on-one. It was just impossible. But he suffered a pinched nerve in his neck around like 76, I want to say. And he was still a good player the last 4 or 5 years of his career. Don't get me wrong. He was still making Pro Bowls and everything. And they won 2 Super Bowls in the late 70s. But he wasn't anywhere near the dominant player that he was over the first stretch of his career. So, I mean, to say that a player doesn't deserve to get in because he only dominated for 6 years, I mean, that happens a lot in the NFL. I mean, there are a lot of players that had 10, 11-year careers, but only 5 or 6 of them were they at their most dominant, right? So I think from that standpoint alone, the fact that he was the premier receiver of his day, in my opinion, that makes Antonio Brown a Hall of Fame player. Now, does he get on the first ballot? That's debatable. Again, I think just basically by watching how he performed during his prime, I think he was a first ballot player. But football writers might look at it differently. I mean, here's a guy whose career might be over, and it was all self-inflicted, and writers might not look at that with a sympathetic eye. They might say, well, okay, this guy wasn't injured, this guy wasn't cut, this guy didn't get sick or anything. He was a jerk, which he was. There's no question about it. He was a diva, and he was such a diva, and he was such a problem off the field that by the end, teams just didn't want anything to do with him anymore. So he effectively sabotaged his own career. So we don't have any sympathy for him. So we're not going to vote for him. I could very easily see writers doing that, especially when, the first year that he's eligible. They might say we're not gonna vote this guy in on his first try. Screw that. He doesn't deserve that kind of honor. Okay, I get that. But to suggest that he should never be in, no, this guy's a Hall of Fame football player, regardless of his character. Remember, there's no morality clause, as far as I know, when it comes to voting for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So, that's not that really shouldn't factor into it for these guys. I mean, obviously it's probably going to, but ultimately, if they just judge him based on the era in which he played, then I think eventually he's going to get in, because Lynn Swann and John Stallworth were never the greatest receivers of their day. They were maybe the greatest receiving duo of their day, a la Mark Clayton and Mark Duper, although I think they were better receivers than Clayton and Duper, but they weren't. Neither one of those guys was ever considered the best receiver of his day. They they performed great on the big stage. Don't get me wrong. I mean, those guys just turned in legendary performances in the Super Bowl and in the playoffs. But let's be real. Back before either one of those guys got elected into the Hall of Fame, Swan was 01 and Starworth was 02. At the time, those guys were when people talked about Swan and Starworth, they talked about them the way people talk about Hines Ward today. That they were borderline Hall of Famers at best. They didn't have the numbers, they didn't have the kind of careers, the dominant careers that Hall of Fame that warranted being elected to the Hall of Fame. But eventually they got in. I think a lot of the reason why they did get in is because they were on arguably the greatest dynasty of all time. I think that helped them. And the fact, again, that they performed well on the big stage. A guy like Hines Ward, it's unfortunate because I think he's a Hall of Fame caliber player too. But for whatever reason, he's being punished because of his stats. He didn't. A guy like T.O. had 1,500 receptions. He had 1,000. Okay, so he's being punished for that. But also, in fairness to people who aren't voting for Hines Ward to make it to the Hall of Fame, was he ever considered the premier receiver of his day when he played? No, he was one of the best. Of course, he was a Pro Bowler. He was an All-Pro. He was certainly the best receiver on the Steelers roster throughout the majority of his career here. But he was never considered one of the greatest receivers of his day ever. He just wasn't. He wasn't one of the top one or two receivers of his era. So, writers are probably judging him on the stats, but I think more than that, they're judging him on the fact that he wasn't the dominant receiver of his day. I think that's ultimately what's hurting Hines Ward's chances of making it to Hall. I think he'll get in eventually. I think he'll get in. Maybe like a Donnie Shell when he's much older, which might be unfortunate that a player has to wait that long to get in. But hey, when you're a borderline, if you had a career that's borderline Hall of Fame worthy, where you're in the discussion for that, I think you had a pretty darn good career, and it's hard to really feel sorry for a guy like that. But back to Antonio Brown. To sum that all up, his career transcended his Steeler career anyway, transcended stats, and it transcended Super Bowls and championships. Some players are just Hall of Fame players, regardless of their stats and regardless of the team accomplishments, right? And I think Antonio Brown was one of those guys. And that brings me to my next point about Antonio Brown, and that's this notion that the Steelers didn't win because of Brown, that they failed to reach the holy grail, so to speak, because of Antonio Brown, because he undermined them, so to speak, which I think is just silly, because first of all, he was such a dominant football player for them. He was the perfect wide receiver. I mean, route running, catching, receiving, everything. He was just a great, complete football player. So, and he was productive. He was insanely productive over a 6-year period. But I mean, even before his great run started in 2013, I mean, he was pretty good from 2010 through 2012. And he was also incredibly clutch, right? I mean, people, I think a lot of times when a player betrays a team like he betrayed the Steelers and their fans and the media, we tend to just convict them based on the last thing that they did. He was a jerk on his way out, so we're never going to acknowledge his greatness. But this guy was an absolute clutch football player. I mean, time and time again, starting in his rookie year when he was just a nobody. I mean, Emmanuel Sanders was in those days, he was expected. He was the 3rd round pick in the 2010 draft. Manny Sanders. He was really expected to be the guy that was going to win out in that duel between the two of them. The two pups, one bone thing that Mike Tomlin had going on with those guys back then. It was supposed to be Emmanuel Sanders. He was the higher draft pick. But Antonio Brown was, even back then, he was clutch. The helmet catch on 3rd and 19 in the divisional round against the Ravens in 2010, and then of course the following week the big catch on 3rd down and 6 that clinched the trip to the Super Bowl in the AFC Championship game against the Jets. It clinched their AFC champion, their conference title. So he was clutch all the way back then, and he continued to be clutch all the way throughout his career. The immaculate extension, the even a couple years ago against the Bengals, that play. Some people say it was an illegal pick, but whatever. It was a great play. I can go on and on and on. The game against the Packers a few years ago with the incredible sideline catch that set up the game-winning field goal by Chris Boswell, the 50-yard field goal, the catch and touchdown against the Chiefs. Again, there's probably so many that I'm missing. I mean, he was just a clutch performer for them. So to suggest that a guy like that prevented a team from winning the Super Bowl, again, it's just silly. The reason why they didn't win titles in that era is because they weren't as good as people thought they were. Right? They weren't. A lot of people, at the time, we kind of knew the Steelers of the mid-2010s were a team that was essentially propped up by Ben, Bell, and Brown, the killer bees, and a good offensive line. They had a hell of an offense, but the defense was suspect. We knew this at the time, but we look back on it and we say, I've seen people and I've heard people say things like, they had such a, the best roster in the league, and yet they underachieved. Tomlin had all this talent to work with, and they underachieved. No, that's not what was going on back then. What was going on back then is they were an incomplete football team, one that was, again, carried by 3 or 4 individuals on offense, and they could have gone further than they did. I mean, had they not been screwed in the Jesse James game against the Patriots, they get the number 1 seed. Who knows? Maybe they go to the Super Bowl, but. When you look at how average that defense was prior to really last year, the defense didn't really become anything until last year, but it started to become better in 2017 with them becoming a really proficient at getting after the quarterback. But like 2014, 2015, 2016, I mean, they weren't getting after the quarterback. They weren't able to stop anybody on third down. They weren't able to take the football away. That didn't start until last year. They were averaging 18, 19 takeaways a game for almost a decade. Or I'm sorry, a season, not a game, a season. So, that's ultimately why they didn't win championships in those years. Not because of Brown being toxic or Bell being toxic or any of that other stuff that people like to point to. They just didn't win because they weren't good enough, ultimately. I think we could look back on that and admit that. And also, they had a lot of bad luck with injuries. Obviously Shazier in 2017, Le'Veon Bell, they lost him in the playoffs in 2016. He was on a great run, setting record after record in the playoffs, and then he gets hurt against the Patriots, and it ruins their whole game plan. 2015, they lost Bell and D'Angelo Williams. They lost Brown in the playoffs. Ironically enough, it was his injury that led to them beating the Bengals in a wild card game, but obviously he couldn't play against the Broncos the following week in the divisional round, and his absence, I'm sure, didn't help. And in 2014, they lost Bell, the last regular season game of the year against the Bengals, going into the playoffs. He was their meal ticket that year, Le'Veon Bell. So they had a lot of bad luck with injuries, and they just weren't a complete football team because they had to. Their defense, they were in transition for years, trying to make their defense dominant again after the Super Bowl era from 2004 through 2010, when they had some of the greatest defenses ever under Dick LeBeau. So I think that was really why they lost. It wasn't because of locker room chemistry. I mean, that helps, but I think ultimately, as we found out last year, when you're missing a lot of talent, that's the key. You give me, as I've written about before, you give me 53 Antonio Browns with all of his troubles, complete with all of his troubles, you're probably going to win a lot of games and maybe even a couple championships. You give me 53 guys who aren't that talented but have great heart, maybe they overachieve every now and then, but they're probably not going to win. So those are all the topics I had today, and now I'll scroll through the live chat and see if you have any questions, see if I missed any. And by the way, I have to apologize every week because every Saturday because I can't really follow a live chat while I'm talking. I just can't do that. I'm not that proficient at it yet. But let's see. Here's one from Donald Nolan. Great question. What if they kept Sanders over Brown? Does that change our playoffs or Super Bowl run? No, I think Brown was a better player than Emmanuel Sanders by far. I mean, I just as I said, I think Antonio Brown was a premier receiver of his day. Emmanuel Sanders was and has been really good, but he never achieved the levels of Brown. And a lot of people, I just want to touch on one thing I missed. I wanted to bring it up, but I missed it. People like to use the argument that Big Ben made Brown. And of course he did. But Jerry Rice had 2 Hall of Fame receivers throwing him the football throughout his career, right? I mean, it's just, it's hard to have a great receiver and not have a great quarterback throwing him the football. It's hard to have one without the other. So yeah, Brown benefited from Big Ben, from Ben Roethlisberger, but a lot of great receivers throughout history benefited from having great quarterbacks throwing the football. Raymond Berry had Johnny Unitas. I mean, all the way back then. So it's not. I don't think that's a slight. I don't think that's something we can use against Brown, that he had a Hall of Fame quarterback throwing him the football, because most receivers benefit from that. Let's see what else we have here. Here's one from I'm sorry if I'm having trouble. Azatic Noble. Who thinks that Johnson will overtake that number 1 spot? A lot of people do. A lot of people are high on Deontay Johnson based on last year. I mean, he really showed out last year in his rookie year. I mean, he did a great job considering the quarterback play and the fact that Juju was struggling with injuries, and of course, I'm sure Deontay Johnson benefited from the fact that Juju had faced a lot of double teams week in and week out. But yeah, for a guy that was, ironically enough, a guy that was compared to Brown as far as his skill set coming into the league, he looked a lot like Antonio Brown last year. And if his game continues to evolve to the point where he's that good of a football player, that good of a receiver, then I think it's inevitable that he takes over the number 1 spot ahead of Juju. But I mean, again, in today's, you can define a number 1 receiver in so many different ways. Is it the fact that he's an X or a Y or a Z, or is it just in terms of production? Is he the number 1 guy that they go to? Like Hines Ward, throughout his career, he was best suited as a slot receiver, but he was the Steelers' number 1 guy as far as who they went to. I mean, there was no question when it was 3rd and 4, 3rd and 5, 3rd and 8, whatever, who Ben was looking for, and it was Hines Ward more often than not. He was the guy that Ben was looking for, but he wasn't a traditional number 1 guy. So in terms of status, will Johnson ever overtake that number 1 spot? I don't know. In terms of production, I mean, the talent's certainly there for him to do that. There's no question. So let's see. Here's a comment from Ezra. Folks, we need to re-sign Juju. He's a stud at 23 that had a bad year with backup quarterbacks. We will regret letting Juju walk. And I tend to agree with that. I love Juju. I'm a big Juju supporter. I've been a fan of his ever since. I love his personality. I love the fact that he's involved with the community. And of course, I love the fact that he was, excuse me, immensely productive over his first 2 years, And he was a victim of circumstance last year with the quarterback play, and like letting him walk may be a big mistake. But as I mentioned earlier with the salary cap, it might be out of their hands, and we discussed this a few months ago right after the draft. Even with a $215 million salary cap, trying to pay Juju that kind of money when you have 3 other really good young receivers, do you want to spend that much money on a number 1 receiver when you have a Deontay Johnson who looks like he's primed to be a superstar, when you have a James Washington who really, again, his 2019 campaign, I think, is being totally underrated and overlooked. I think he had for as much as he struggled in his rookie year of 2018, he really showed me a lot last year, despite the problems with the offense and the quarterback play and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, you have Chase Claypool, who looks like he has an opportunity to be a stud in the league someday soon. So it might just be a matter of him being too expensive. And if you're a team like the Steelers with a Super Bowl window that might finally be shut in a couple of years, if you have Ben retiring, maybe you want to start over. Maybe you don't want to pay a guy like Juju, what, $130 million, whatever it would be, the total sum of a contract. I don't know what number one guys are making right now, number one receivers, but do you want to pay a guy like that much money when you're kind of rebuilding? So it might not be a matter of them letting him walk. It might just be a matter of them, first of all, not being able to do anything about it because they don't have enough room under the cap with this decrease in revenue. And number two, they might just say, look, we're going to rebuild. I just watched the all 10 episodes of the Last Dance, the documentary of the 97-98 Bulls team. They were going for their sixth title, and in 8 years, and they won. And instead of just moving forward, they just everybody got too expensive. Of course, Jordan was Jordan. They were never going to not pay him, but guys like Scottie Pippen and Steve Kerr, et cetera, they were just too expensive, and they decided to just blow it all up. Of course, they haven't been the same since. Maybe had they known what they know now, maybe they would have tried to keep that team together for a few more years, but they had a great run. So maybe, they just decide that they're going to, when Ben does retire, they're just going to totally rebuild and go in a different direction and hopefully find a replacement of quarterback sooner rather than later and build around him with younger, less expensive talent. You just don't know. And there's one from Doc Holliday. This is a comment you can make every year, but especially next year because it's really going to be strapped. The Steelers have to work on the cap. Don't get much bang for their buck. Always strapped. Yeah, and I mean they're strapped this year at $198 million. So you can only imagine what it's going to look like next year. Here's a comment from Brian Delaney. I really think Juju could settle for a little less with the connection he has made with the people in Pittsburgh. I mean, that's a good point, but it all depends on how much less. I mean, is he going to settle for that much less than he can make on the open market? I mean, there are hometown discounts, and then there are hometown discounts. And if the Steelers really lowball him on an offer, not because they want to, but because they have to, then he's probably just going to walk, because I think, these guys have to make the money while they can, and it seems weird to say because, they're making so much money as it is. But when you have a chance to maximize your earning potential on your second contract, that's usually when players are able to make their most money. And, he's probably going to try to get as much as he can because, you never know when your last game's going to be, right? So let's see here. Well, here's another one from Ezra. Comment. Dare I say, pull a Charger move and let Ben go after 2020 like they did Rivers? Save money, sign the young studs, get a quarterback in free agency, or Fields in the draft. I guess Fields is a stud, a college quarterback. I don't know much about him at this point, but that's, again, if you do decide to let Ben walk after this year, I mean, how much, or not walk, because I mean he would still be under contract. You would have to cut him, and how much would he cut? How much dead money would count against the cap, right? That's the thing you have to worry about, and it's not something that a lot of teams tend to do. But hey, you never know. If he struggles this year, if he looks like he doesn't have it, maybe they move on from him after this year, especially considering they're going to have to make a lot of tough. It looks like they're going to have to make a lot of tough decisions next off season based on the salary cap. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys today, and as always, I appreciate you joining me. And again, I want you to tune in Monday afternoon at 5 o'clock, or Monday evening, I should say, at 5 o'clock with Brian and myself for Steelers Q&A, followed by the Retro Show. Until then, have a great weekend. Take care, everybody.